close your eyes for a moment. Just breathe. Let your body sink into wherever you are right now. Let the weight of your day begin to fall away, slowly, gently, like leaves drifting down from an autumn tree. You do not need to go anywhere. You do not need to do anything. All you need to do is listen. And as you listen, something quite extraordinary is going to happen. You are going to travel back in time. Not in a rushed, dramatic, explosive way. No, you are going to drift there, softly, the way sleep itself arrives. Quietly, gradually, peacefully. You are going to travel back nearly 2,000 years. Back to the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. Back to the cobblestoned, smoky, sun-warmed streets of Rome. Not the Rome of emperors. Not the Rome of golden thrones and lavish feasts and senators draped in purple silk. No, tonight, we are going somewhere far more real, far more human. We are going to the Rome that most people actually lived in. The Rome of ordinary men and women. The Rome of bakers and potters and fishermen and slaves and freedmen and mothers and children who woke up every single morning wondering the same simple, ancient, deeply human question that people still ask today. What are we going to eat? That is our journey tonight. What did the poor people of ancient Rome actually eat every single day of their lives? Not on feast days, not on special occasions. Every day, the humble, quiet, repetitive, surprisingly fascinating story of daily food in the ancient world's greatest city. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of this story together, you will have learned something genuinely wonderful. Something that connects you, across 20 centuries of human history, to people who were, in so many ways, remarkably like you. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles soften. There is no hurry here. This story has been waiting 2,000 years to be told this gently. And tonight, it is yours. To understand what poor Romans ate, you first need to understand the city they lived in. And Rome, at the height of its power, somewhere around the 1st and 2nd centuries after the birth of Christ, was unlike anything the world had ever seen before or would see again for more than 1,000 years. Imagine, if you will, a city of somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people. Some historians even suggest the population climbed higher than that during the city's peak. All of them living, breathing, cooking, arguing, sleeping, worshiping, buying and selling within an area that, by modern standards, was not particularly large. The city was dense, extraordinarily dense, packed together in a way that would feel almost claustrophobic to modern eyes. The wealthy minority lived in grand single-family homes called domus. These were spacious, airy, built around open courtyards with fountains and gardens. They had their own kitchens, their own slaves to do the cooking, their own storerooms full of wine and olive oil and preserved fish and grain. But the vast majority of Romans, and when we say vast majority, we mean somewhere between 90 and 95% of the population, did not live in anything like that. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae. The word means islands in Latin, and when you understand the city they rose from, you understand why. These buildings were islands of humanity in a sea of narrow, winding streets. They rose sometimes 5, 6, 7 stories high. The higher you lived, the poorer you were, because the higher floors meant more stairs to climb, further from the street-level shops, further from the communal water fountains, and crucially, further from the ground if the building caught fire, which they did, with alarming regularity. The ground floors of insulae were often occupied by shops called tabernae, little open-fronted stalls where craftsmen worked and merchants sold their goods. Above the tabernae, the apartments grew smaller and darker and more crowded as they climbed toward the sky. A family of 4 or 5 might share a single room. No running water. No private toilet. No kitchen. No fireplace. No kitchen. This is perhaps the single most important fact you need to hold in your mind as we begin our exploration of what poor Romans ate. Most of them could not cook at home, not because they did not know how, not because they did not want to, but because they literally did not have the means to do so. The fire risk in buildings made of wood and mud brick was so catastrophic that cooking fires inside upper-floor apartments were either heavily restricted or completely impossible in practice. The emperors themselves issued edicts trying to regulate fires in the city, and yet Rome burned again and again throughout its history. So what did people do? How did a city of 1 million souls feed itself every single day, when most of those souls had no kitchen, no stove, no means to prepare their own food at home? The answer to that question is where our story truly begins. Before we talk about where Romans got their food, we need to talk about what that food actually was. And at the very center of everything, at the absolute heart of the Roman poor person's diet, was grain, specifically wheat. And before wheat became common, an even older grain called emmer, or far in Latin, which Romans sometimes called spelt. Grain was not just a food for ancient Romans. It was not simply one item on a shopping list among many. Grain was life. Grain was civilization. Grain was the substance upon which the entire Roman world was built, quite literally. The Roman army marched on grain. The Roman cities were fed on grain. The Roman poor survived on grain. And the Roman government understood this so completely that they built an entire political and economic system around ensuring that grain reached the city's population. Let us start at the very beginning of the grain's journey, because it is a journey worth taking slowly, and we have all the time in the world tonight. The grain that fed Rome came from far away, not primarily from Italy itself, though Italian farms certainly produced wheat and other crops. Rome's hunger was simply too vast, its population too enormous, for the Italian peninsula to satisfy alone. The great grain-producing regions that kept Rome alive were places like Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, with its impossibly fertile Nile Delta fields that flooded every year and deposited rich dark silt that grew wheat in almost magical abundance. Sicily, too, was a major supplier. North Africa, the region the Romans called Africa Proconsularis, stretching across what is now Tunisia and parts of Libya. Sardinia. These were the granaries of empire. Every year, great fleets of grain ships would sail across the Mediterranean Sea, loaded to the waterline with sacks of grain, making their way toward the port city of Ostia, which sat at the mouth of the Tiber River, about 16 miles downstream from Rome itself. When the ships arrived, their grain was unloaded by dock workers, transferred into enormous riverside warehouses called horia, and then slowly, steadily, transported up the Tiber by barge toward the city. In Rome, the grain was distributed through a system that modern historians have spent considerable effort trying to fully understand, because it was genuinely remarkable. There was something called the annona, the grain supply system, which was managed by a government official called the praefectus annoni, the prefect of the grain supply. This person had one of the most important jobs in the entire empire. If the grain supply failed, Rome would starve. If Rome starved, there would be riots. If there were riots, emperors fell. The connection between bread and political power was so direct, so immediate, so undeniable, that the Romans themselves had a phrase for what their leaders needed to provide to keep the population content. Panem et circenses. Bread and circuses. The bread part came first. Always. For the poorest citizens of Rome, the grain dole was a lifeline of extraordinary importance. This system, which evolved over centuries, eventually provided free or heavily subsidized grain to a significant portion of Rome's free citizen population. At various points in Roman history, somewhere between 150,000 and 320,000 men were registered for the grain dole, which means when you include their families, perhaps a third or more of the city's free population depended on it to some meaningful degree. Each registered citizen would receive a tessera, a small token, like a ticket, that they could exchange at specific distribution points around the city for their monthly allocation of grain. The standard allocation was about 5 modii per month. A modius was a Roman unit of dry measure, roughly equivalent to about 8.5 modern liters, or about 9 pounds in weight. 5 modii per month of grain was not luxury. It was subsistence, enough to survive, if supplemented by other foods, but not enough on its own to thrive. Now, when the poor Roman received their grain, they did not receive it already baked into bread. They received the raw grain itself, which then presented them with a challenge. How do you turn raw wheat into something edible when you have no kitchen, no oven, and no reliable means to light a cooking fire? The answer, for many centuries before bread became widespread, was porridge. The Romans called it pulse, and it was the foundational food of Roman civilization for generations before wheat bread became the standard. Pulse was extraordinarily simple. You took your grain, crushed or ground it roughly, and cooked it with water over a fire to create a thick, dense, starchy porridge. It could be enriched slightly with salt, with oil if you had any, with a bit of cheese or dried vegetables if you were lucky. But at its most basic, pulse was grain and water. Nothing more, nothing less. The Romans of later periods, the sophisticated city dwellers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, looked back on pulse with a mixture of pride and slight embarrassment. Pride because it was the food of their ancestors, the tough farmers and soldiers who had built the Republic through sheer hard work and simple living. Embarrassment because it was the food of the poor, the unsophisticated, the rural. The wealthy Roman of the imperial period would not have been caught dead eating plain pulse. But for the poor, it remained a staple, a fallback, the thing you ate when everything else ran out. Over time, the milling and baking of grain became more sophisticated. Rome developed a remarkable network of mills and bakeries that transformed raw grain into bread at an industrial scale. The bakeries of Rome, called pastrina, were not like modern bakeries. They were production facilities. Enormous millstones, often made from the volcanic basalt rock of the Alban Hills south of Rome, were powered by donkeys or mules walking in circles, grinding grain into flour hour after hour, day after day. The flour was then mixed, kneaded, shaped, and baked in large beehive-shaped clay ovens that reached tremendous temperatures. The bread that came out of these ovens was dense, round, often scored across the top in a distinctive pattern that divided the loaf into portions. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, found bakeries remarkably well preserved, complete with their millstones, their ovens, and in several cases, the actual loaves of bread themselves, carbonized but recognizable, still sitting on the oven shelves where they had been placed the morning the volcano erupted. These loaves were not what we would today call light and airy. They were heavy, chewy, substantial. The grain was not always finely milled, so there were flecks and pieces of bran throughout. Modern nutritionists would likely approve of the fiber content. Ancient Romans simply accepted it as the nature of bread. The wealthy could afford more finely milled flour, which produced a whiter, lighter bread. The poor ate darker, coarser bread. The difference in bread color was a visible marker of social class, obvious to anyone who knew how to look. Now we arrive at one of the most wonderful and surprising discoveries of Roman archaeology, something that, when you first learn about it, makes ancient Rome feel suddenly, startlingly modern and familiar. Because of the fire risk in their apartment buildings, because of the lack of private kitchens, because of the sheer density of urban life, poor Romans relied heavily on something that we, in the 21st century, would immediately recognize. Street food, takeaway food, what we might today call fast food. The establishments that provided this service were called thermopolia, from the Greek words for hot and to sell. A thermopolium was, in essence, a hot food counter, and they were everywhere in Rome. Absolutely everywhere. In Pompeii alone, which was a moderately sized provincial city, not even close to the scale of Rome itself, archaeologists have identified at least 80 separate thermopolia. If you scale that up to the size of Rome, you are looking at hundreds, possibly thousands, of these establishments scattered throughout the city. What did a thermopolium look like? Picture walking down a narrow Roman street. The buildings on either side rise high above you, blocking the morning sun. The street itself is paved with large, irregular stones, worn smooth by generations of feet and cart wheels. On either side of the street, at ground level, are open-fronted shops. Some sell vegetables, some sell wine, some sell pottery. And then you come to the thermopolium. It looks like a counter, a long L-shaped or straight counter built from stone and mortar, faced with marble or decorative plaster. And set into the top of this counter are large ceramic vessels called dolia, wide-mouthed clay jars, partially sunk into the counter so that only their upper portions are visible above the surface. These dolia contain food, hot food, kept warm by the stone counter itself, which might have had a heating system beneath it, or simply retain the warmth of the food within. In 2020, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii announced the discovery of one of the most remarkably preserved thermopolia ever found. The thermopolium of Regio V, as it became known, was extraordinary. Not only were the counter and dolia intact, but analysis of the contents of those dolia revealed what had actually been inside them on the day Vesuvius erupted. And the findings were fascinating. Researchers found traces of duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, and wine. They found evidence of fava beans and various herbs used for flavoring. They found remnants of what appeared to be a complex stew or prepared dish combining multiple ingredients. This was not simple food. This was cooked food, prepared food, food that required skill and ingredients and time that many poor Romans simply did not have at home. And so they bought it here, at the counter, for a few coins. The thermopolium was the poor Roman's kitchen in a very real sense. You went there in the morning for your breakfast. You went there in the middle of the day for a quick midday meal. You went there in the evening for something warm before you climbed the stairs back to your apartment. You brought your own cup, perhaps, and had it filled with cheap wine. You pointed to the dolia and indicated what you wanted. The owner or a slave working there scooped it out for you. The menus, insofar as we can reconstruct them, were not elaborate. They featured the kinds of foods that could be prepared in advance, kept warm for hours, and served quickly. Stews were common, thick mixtures of legumes and vegetables, perhaps with small pieces of meat. Soups, porridges, chickpeas cooked with herbs, lentils, beans of various kinds. Occasionally, for those who could afford it, a small piece of grilled meat or fish. Simple food, filling food, the food of people who needed to eat quickly and get back to their work. The thermopolium was also a social space. People did not only go there to eat and leave immediately. They gathered, they talked, they shared news and gossip. The counter was a meeting point, a neighborhood institution. The owner of a successful thermopolium knew their regulars by name, knew their preferences, knew who was having a bad week and who had just received good news. It was the ancient world's equivalent of the neighborhood cafe, the corner diner, the local takeaway where everyone knows your name. If grain was the foundation of the Roman poor person's diet, then legumes were the pillars. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, and various other pulses provided the protein and additional calories that grain alone could not supply. And they were, compared to meat, extremely affordable, accessible to almost anyone who had even a modest amount of money to spend on food. The Romans ate legumes in enormous quantities. There is a reason that some of Rome's oldest and most prominent families had surnames that derived from legumes. The Fabii came from faba, the fava bean. The lentili came from lens, the lentil. The Pisii derived from pisum, the pea. And most famously of all, the Cicero family, which gave the world Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the greatest orators and writers in human history, took its name from Cicer, the chickpea. The story goes that an ancestor of the Cicero family had a distinctive chickpea-shaped wart on his nose. Whatever the actual origin, The fact that such distinguished families bore the names of humble legumes tells you something profound about how deeply rooted these foods were in Roman culture, going all the way back to the earliest days of the Republic when even the aristocracy ate simple peasant food. Fava beans were perhaps the most ancient and fundamental of Rome's legumes. They had been cultivated in the Mediterranean region for thousands of years before Rome even existed as a city. They could be eaten at multiple stages of their development. Young and tender, they could be eaten raw or lightly cooked, almost like a vegetable. More mature beans could be dried and stored for months, providing food security through the lean winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce. Dried fava beans could be soaked in water, then cooked slowly until soft, seasoned with oil and salt and herbs, and eaten as a thick, hearty dish. Lentils were similarly versatile and ancient. The Roman writer Apicius, whose cookbook is one of the most important documents of ancient Roman cuisine, includes recipes for lentils that call for cumin, coriander, mint, and various other herbs and spices. Even in their simplest form, plain boiled lentils seasoned with nothing more than salt and a splash of olive oil. They were nourishing, filling, and possessed of a pleasant earthy flavor that sustained the working poor through long days of physical labor. Chickpeas were another staple. They could be cooked into soups and stews. They could be ground into flour and used to make a kind of flatbread or pancake. They could be roasted and sold as a street snack, the ancient equivalent of the salted nuts or pretzels you might find at a modern bar. Roasted chickpeas were sold by street vendors throughout Roman cities, sold cheaply, eaten by hand while walking, the most casual and accessible of all Roman snack foods. The poor Romans' relationship with legumes was deeply practical. They were cheap. They kept well when dried. They were filling. They could be cooked into a dozen different preparations using the same basic ingredients. They could be bought from street vendors or cooked yourself over a small brazier if you had one. They required no great culinary skill to prepare, and they were genuinely nutritious, providing protein and fiber and various micronutrients that helped sustain the bodies of people who worked hard physical jobs day after day. There was, however, a social stigma attached to legumes, just as there was with coarse bread. The wealthy ate meat. The wealthy ate fine fish. The wealthy ate elaborate dishes prepared by skilled cooks using expensive ingredients. The poor ate beans, and Romans were very much aware of this distinction. The satirical poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century AD, has numerous references to the bean-eating poor, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes mocking, always clearly marking the social boundary between those who could afford better and those who could not. But here is something beautiful about this story. Here is something that the wealthy Romans perhaps did not fully appreciate, or perhaps did not wish to acknowledge. The poor Romans, eating their beans and their bread and their lentil soup and their chickpea porridge, were in many ways eating more healthily than their wealthy counterparts. The rich Romans' diet, heavy in meat and wine and extraordinarily rich sauces, heavy with the preserved fish sauce called garum that contained tremendous amounts of sodium, was not necessarily kinder to the body than the simple plant-heavy diet of the poor. Modern nutritional science would have a great deal to say about this irony. The humble diet of the Roman poor was, in many ways, closer to what we today understand as genuinely good nutrition than the lavish excess of the Roman wealthy. There is one ingredient that appears in nearly every account of Roman food, in every class of society, in every region of the Roman world, from the humblest peasant's meal to the most elaborate senatorial banquet. One ingredient that was so fundamental, so universal, so deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life that it transcended the boundaries of wealth and poverty in a way that almost nothing else did. Olive oil. Olive oil was not just a cooking ingredient in ancient Rome. It was food, light, medicine, soap, and a form of currency all at once. The Romans used olive oil for absolutely everything. They cooked with it, of course, but they also rubbed it into their skin and hair after bathing. They used it to fuel the lamps that lit their homes and streets after dark. Athletes anointed themselves with it before training or competition. It was used in religious rituals and ceremonies. It was offered to the gods. It was used to anoint the bodies of the dead. The olive tree was sacred in the Mediterranean world and had been for thousands of years before Rome rose to power. The ancient Greeks had their myths about the olive, about how Athena gave the gift of the olive tree to Athens and thereby won the patronage of that city. The Romans had their own reverence for the olive, though expressed less mythologically and more practically, as was the Roman way. Olive oil production in the ancient world was a massive industry. Olive groves covered enormous areas of Italy, Greece, Spain, and North Africa. The harvesting of olives was hard, seasonal work, done by hand. The olives picked or beaten from the branches and collected in baskets. They were then taken to pressing facilities where enormous stone or wooden presses crushed the olives to extract their oil. The first pressing produced the finest oil, clearest and most flavorful. Subsequent pressings produced progressively lower quality oil, darker, more bitter, more acidic. For the wealthy, only the finest first pressing oil was acceptable. For the poor, whatever oil they could afford was what they used, which often meant the lower quality pressings, or oil that had traveled long distances and might be somewhat past its best quality. But even indifferent olive oil was still olive oil, still the fat that gave flavor and calories to otherwise plain food. Still the liquid that transformed simple boiled vegetables or lentils into something that felt almost luxurious. The grain dole included olive oil at certain points in Roman history. Emperors, understanding the political importance of ensuring the population had adequate nutrition, sometimes expanded the dole to include not just grain, but also oil, and occasionally wine and pork. When this happened, it was greeted with genuine popular enthusiasm, because it meant the difference between truly bare subsistence and something approaching adequacy. For the poor Roman at home, with no kitchen, olive oil could be used without cooking. Bread dipped in olive oil was a meal. Not the most exciting meal, not the most varied or nutritious, but genuinely filling and genuinely caloric. Many poor Romans ate exactly this, especially for their morning meal, the ientaculum, which was typically the lightest and simplest eating occasion of the day. A piece of bread, dipped in oil, perhaps with a sprinkle of salt, perhaps with a few olives, perhaps with nothing at all beyond the oil itself. The olives themselves, beyond being the source of the precious oil, were also eaten directly. Preserved olives, cured in brine or oil, were sold at markets and from street vendors throughout Roman cities. They were salty, intensely flavored, calorie-dense, and could be stored for long periods. A handful of olives and a piece of bread was the ancient Roman equivalent of a quick lunch grabbed on the go. Simple, unpretentious, but satisfying in the way that intensely flavored food always is, even in small quantities. Of all the foods and flavors of ancient Rome, none is perhaps more fascinating, more surprising, and more immediately polarizing to modern sensibilities than garum. And yet, if you want to understand what poor Romans actually ate, you cannot avoid garum, because it was everywhere, absolutely everywhere, in rich food and poor food alike, in elaborate cooked dishes and simple street food, in sauces and soups, and the most basic daily seasoning. Garum was fish sauce, a condiment made by fermenting fish, typically small fish like anchovies or mackerel, along with their entrails, in large clay vessels with salt. The fermentation process was a long one, lasting weeks or months, during which the fish slowly broke down into a liquid that was intensely, powerfully, almost shockingly flavorful. The Romans called it by several names depending on its quality. Garum was the term for the finest quality. Liquamen was perhaps more commonly used for everyday fish sauce. Muria was a lower quality, cloudier version. Alec was the solid paste that remained after the liquid was extracted, used by the very poorest as a cheap flavoring. The production of garum was, by many ancient accounts, extraordinarily smelly. Cities that produced it in large quantities were sometimes criticized by neighbors and travelers for the pervasive odor that surrounded their fish sauce production facilities. Yet the Romans loved it absolutely. They put it on almost everything. Modern scholars comparing garum to other traditional fermented fish sauces around the world, like the Vietnamese nuoc cham or the Southeast Asian fish pastes, have noted that the flavor profile, despite the alarming production process, is actually deeply pleasant. Intensely savory, rich with what we now call umami, the fifth taste that humans are wired to find deeply satisfying. For the poor Roman, garum served a crucial function. It was cheap. A small amount of the lower quality versions was affordable even for people with very little money, and it transformed plain, simple food dramatically. A bowl of boiled lentils with a splash of garum became something with genuine depth of flavor. A piece of bread dipped in oil and touched with a few drops of garum had a savory richness that simple oil alone could not provide. A simple vegetable stew seasoned with garum tasted complex and satisfying in a way that mere salt could not achieve. The Romans were not the only ancient civilization to discover the magic of fermented fish sauce. It appears in ancient Greece, in ancient China, in cultures across Southeast Asia. But the Romans took it to a level of sophistication and industrial scale that was unprecedented in the ancient world. Garum factories were found throughout the Roman Empire, from Spain to Britain to North Africa. And the best garum, the finest quality product, traveled extraordinary distances, transported in distinctive tall clay vessels called amphorae, stamped with the producer's name and the contents, traded as a luxury commodity across thousands of miles. But for the poor Roman on a budget, the cheap local garum was sufficient. It got the job done. It added flavor and depth to food that might otherwise be almost painfully monotonous. And in doing so, it made the difference between merely surviving on the minimum necessary nutrition and actually experiencing something that could be called, with genuine sincerity, pleasure at the table. Now that we understand the building blocks, the grain and the legumes and the olive oil and the garum, let us walk through an ordinary day in the life of a poor Roman and see how these foods actually appeared in their daily rhythm. Because the Romans, like most cultures, had a structure to their eating, a sequence to the day, meals that came at particular times for particular reasons. The Romans recognized 3 meals in a typical day, though the first 2 were often quite minimal and the third was the main event. They called these meals the ientaculum, the prandium, and the cena, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, though the Roman versions of these meals were quite different from what we might imagine today. The ientaculum, the morning meal, was typically taken very early. Rome was a city that rose with the sun, earlier even than the sun in many cases, because the narrow streets of the city were legally restricted to wheeled traffic during the day, meaning that all the delivery carts, the supply wagons, the movement of heavy goods throughout the city happened at night. The streets after dark were filled with the rumble and clatter of cart wheels over stone, the shouts of drivers, the complaints of the mules. The Romans dealt with this nocturnal chaos by going to bed relatively early and rising early, often before full daylight. The ientaculum for a poor Roman was almost invariably simple to the point of starkness. A piece of bread, usually left over from the previous day or bought fresh from one of the city's many bakeries as early as first light, dipped in water or wine to soften it, perhaps rubbed with a little olive oil, perhaps accompanied by a few olives, some dried figs, a small piece of cheese if the household had any, salt, sometimes a handful of raisins for sweetness. This was not a meal to linger over. This was fuel, the thing you ate quickly before heading out the door to begin your day's labor. Children going to school, if their families could afford any education at all, might take their ientaculum with them, eating as they walked to their teacher's doorstep where lessons were conducted. Workers heading to the docks or the building sites or the workshops where they labored ate their breakfast standing up, leaning against a wall, or simply walking. There was no table. There was no chair. There was no ceremony to the ientaculum. It was necessity, consumed as efficiently as possible. The prandium, the midday meal, was similarly unceremonic for the poor. In fact, some poorer Romans may have skipped the midday meal entirely on days when money was particularly tight, or eaten only the very smallest of things. A few olives, a handful of nuts, some dried fruit, a piece of leftover bread. The thermopolia were busy at midday, doing a brisk trade in quick meals for workers who had a brief respite from their labor before the afternoon's work resumed. Here you might buy a small bowl of lentil soup, or a portion of cooked chickpeas, or a piece of flatbread with some kind of topping. You ate it standing at the counter or sitting on the edge of a fountain, and then you went back to work. For the poor Roman, the entire focus of the day's eating was on the cena, the evening meal, which was the main meal of the day and the one to which any amount of care and attention that could be spared was devoted. The cena began in the late afternoon, typically around the 9th or 10th hour of the Roman day, which in our terms would be somewhere around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and might continue for an hour or two for a working-class family, or much longer for wealthier households who had the leisure to turn dining into extended entertainment. For the poor Roman family, the cena was the meal that felt most like a meal. The meal where they sat down together, where food was prepared or purchased with some thought, where the day's events might be discussed, and the family gathered in whatever small space they called home. And what did that cena look like? For many families, it centered on a single main dish, a pottage or thick stew, the kind of thing that had been simmering, either on a small brazier at home or at the thermopolium around the corner, all afternoon. This pottage was the direct descendant of ancient pulse, the grain porridge of Rome's ancestors. It might be made primarily of grain, like a thick wheat porridge, or it might be primarily legume-based, a thick soup of lentils or chickpeas or fava beans, seasoned with whatever was available, a splash of garum, some olive oil, some herbs, perhaps a bit of salted fish or a small piece of cheap pork if the family's finances allowed for such luxury. Around this central dish, there might be smaller accompaniments. Some raw or cooked vegetables, whatever was in season. Onions, which were extremely cheap and widely available, might be eaten raw alongside the bread and stew. Garlic, equally cheap and equally abundant. Leeks, which the Romans were particularly fond of. Turnips, radishes, cucumbers, various herbs. The seasonal rhythm of the vegetable market shaped what appeared on the poor Roman's table. In the good seasons, the summer months when the markets overflowed with produce, were measurably better than the lean winter months when fresh vegetables became scarce and expensive and the diet contracted back toward its most austere grain and legume core. We should pause here and address something that perhaps feels counterintuitive. When we think of feasting in the ancient world, when we think of Roman banquets and lavish meals, we tend to imagine meat, whole roasted animals, birds and fish and haunches of pork. But for the vast majority of Romans, meat was not a regular part of their daily diet. It was a luxury, an occasional pleasure, something you ate on feast days and holidays, something you might eat at one of the city's public banquets, which were sometimes funded by wealthy patrons as a form of political generosity, but not something you had every day, or perhaps even every week. This is important to understand, because it tells us something fundamental about the nature of poverty in the ancient world. The poor Roman was not impoverished in the way that implies starvation, necessarily. They had their bread and their legumes and their oil and their seasonal vegetables. They had enough, on most days, to sustain life. But they lived without the richness, the variety, the protein richness of a meat-based diet that the wealthier classes took for granted. When meat did appear in the poor Roman's diet, it was typically the cheapest and least desirable cuts. The organs and offal that wealthier Romans disdained, things like tripe, intestines, blood, lungs, liver, these were sold cheaply at the meat markets, and a skilled cook could transform them into something genuinely flavorful, though they required more effort than the average poor Roman had the means to invest. Sausages were another option, because sausage making was a way to use every last bit of an animal and preserve it in a convenient, portable form. Roman sausages, seasoned with herbs and spices, were sold from street stalls and at thermopolia, and they were within reach of most Romans, even the poor. Pork was the most commonly consumed meat in ancient Rome at all social levels, though the wealthy ate the prime cuts and the poor ate whatever remained. Pigs were the most efficient animals to keep in urban environments, requiring less space and less feed than cattle, growing quickly, and providing enormous quantities of lard, which was another useful fat for cooking and preservation. Pig fat was cheaper than olive oil and widely used among the poor. In coastal cities and towns throughout the Roman world, fish was a more affordable source of animal protein than meat. The Mediterranean teemed with life. Small fish, anchovies and sardines and mackerel were caught in enormous quantities, and when they were not being converted into garum, they were sold fresh, dried, or salted. Salted and dried fish, which could be stored for long periods and transported great distances, were a staple of the Roman poor's diet along the coasts and even far inland. They were pungent, intensely flavored, and calorie-dense. A small amount of salted fish added to a bowl of grain porridge or legume soup provided both protein and intense flavor. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing with his characteristic acid wit in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, paints a grim picture of the poor urban Roman's diet, contrasting it mercilessly with the lavish excess of the rich. He describes the poor man eating a few small pieces of meat at a public banquet, hurrying to eat as much as possible because such opportunities were rare. He describes the smell of the poor neighborhoods, where the cooking of cheap, strong-flavored food in inadequate conditions produced aromas that the wealthy, passing through in their litters, found offensive. Juvenal's satire is not kind to the poor, but it is, despite its cruelty, probably accurate in its broad outlines. No account of Roman daily life and food would be complete without discussing drink. And the Roman world had strong opinions about what one should drink, how it should be prepared, and what it meant about you socially. Water was the baseline. Rome was, in terms of water infrastructure, arguably the most impressive city in the pre-industrial world. The Roman aqueducts, those extraordinary engineering achievements that carried fresh water from mountain springs and rivers across dozens and sometimes hundreds of miles into the city, delivered an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day into Rome at the city's peak. This was an almost incomprehensible volume of water, more per person per day than many modern cities provide. The water flowed through lead and clay pipes to public fountains scattered throughout the city, where anyone could drink, fill vessels, wash. Private connections to the water supply existed but were a luxury of the wealthy. The poor used the public fountains. Roman water, flowing through lead pipes, was contaminated with lead to a degree that modern public health officials would find alarming. Some historians have argued that chronic low-level lead poisoning may have been a significant factor in Roman society, affecting cognition and health across the population. The Romans themselves were not unaware that something about certain water sources was not ideal, though they did not understand the mechanism of lead toxicity. They simply knew that some water tasted better than others, that certain spring waters were considered healthful, and that the water coming directly from certain old lead pipes was best avoided. Wine was the universal drink of the Roman world in a way that is somewhat difficult for us to fully appreciate today. The Romans drank wine. All Romans, rich and poor alike. At breakfast, at midday, in the evening. Wine was not considered an alcohol to be consumed on special occasions or in moderation as a treat. It was, like bread, a basic daily necessity. The question was not whether you drank wine, but what quality of wine you drank. For the wealthy, wine was a subject of intense connoisseurship. Particular vintages from particular regions were prized and debated with the kind of passionate specificity that modern wine culture might recognize. The wines of Falernian, grown on the volcanic slopes of Campania south of Rome, were considered among the finest and commanded enormous prices. Wines from various Greek islands were prized. Aging wine in sealed clay amphorae was understood to improve it, and old vintages were highly sought after. For the poor, wine meant something entirely different. It meant the cheapest, most basic, most unrefined wine available, and the Romans had several specific terms for the different grades of poor people's wine. Pasca was not even wine in the conventional sense. It was a mixture of sour wine, essentially cheap vinegar wine, diluted with water, sometimes flavored with herbs. It was the drink issued to Roman soldiers as part of their daily rations. It was the drink of the working poor, of slaves, of people who needed something to drink that was safer than potentially contaminated water, but cheaper than actual wine. The Romans almost universally diluted their wine with water before drinking it. Drinking wine undiluted was considered barbaric behavior associated with non-Roman peoples. The ratio of water to wine varied depending on the quality of the wine and the social occasion. For daily drinking, a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine was common. For festive occasions, the mixture might be richer, but always mixed. Cheap wine was sold everywhere in Roman cities. At the thermopolia, of course. From street vendors. From taverns called caponi or popini, which were the social centers of poor neighborhoods, places where men, primarily men, gathered to drink cheap wine, eat simple food, gamble at dice or knucklebones, and talk. The caponi had a somewhat disreputable reputation among the respectable classes, associated with drunkenness, low company, gambling debts, and various other vices. But for the poor, they were a basic social institution, the place where community gathered, where news traveled, where the rhythms of neighborhood life played out daily. Life was not always gray and monotonous for the Roman poor, even at the table. Rome had an extraordinary number of public holidays and religious festivals throughout the year. More than 100 feast days of various kinds were observed in the Roman religious calendar, and many of these occasions involved public feasting, public sacrifice, and the distribution of food to the people. When an animal was sacrificed to the gods in one of Rome's many temples and religious ceremonies, what happened to the carcass after the ritual portions were offered to the deity? In most cases, the meat was cooked and distributed to the gathered crowd. This was one of the primary ways that the Roman poor had access to actual meat in quantities that made a real impression. Public sacrifice was, among other things, a public barbecue, and the smell of roasting meat rising from the temples and public altars on feast days must have been one of the most eagerly anticipated sensory experiences of the Roman poor person's year. Wealthy Roman patrons also funded public feasts as a form of generosity that was simultaneously an act of political ambition. A Roman senator or successful general or wealthy merchant who wanted to build public goodwill and political capital might sponsor a public feast, covering the cost of feeding hundreds or even thousands of people in the public spaces of the city. These occasions were remembered and celebrated, and the name of the sponsor was associated with the generosity of the feast in the public memory for years afterward. At festivals like the Saturnalia, which was celebrated in the week approaching the winter solstice in December, and which had some similarities to later Christmas celebrations in its atmosphere of feasting and gift-giving and temporary reversal of social hierarchies. Even the poorest Romans could expect something a little better than usual. The Saturnalia was a time when traditional social distinctions were somewhat relaxed, when masters might serve their slaves at table, when gifts were exchanged, when the city briefly let its hair down and allowed itself to eat and drink with somewhat more abandon than usual. The games, the gladiatorial spectacles and chariot races that the emperors and other wealthy patrons sponsored at the great amphitheaters and circuses of Rome, were also occasions when food and drink were sometimes distributed to the crowds. Vendors selling food and wine moved through the stands. Sometimes the sponsors of the games arranged for food to be thrown into the crowd, or for tokens called insulae to be distributed that could be exchanged for food or other goods. On these special days, on these feast days and festival occasions, the poor Roman ate in a way that was qualitatively different from the daily routine. More meat, more variety, better wine, perhaps, food that had been prepared with some care and skill. And these occasions were not just about physical nourishment. They were about the pleasure and dignity and social joy of eating well, of participating in the communal abundance that the city occasionally bestowed upon all its residents regardless of class. While our focus tonight has been on Rome itself, the great city at the center of the empire, it is worth pausing to note that the Roman world was vast, stretching from Britain in the north and west to Egypt and Syria in the east, and the poor people throughout this enormous empire did not all eat exactly the same things. The basic patterns were similar, the emphasis on grain, legumes, olive oil, and whatever local produce was available, but the specifics varied considerably by region. In Egypt, the grain was different. Egyptians had long cultivated a particular variety of wheat suited to their environment, and their bread and porridge had a different character than the wheat products of Italy. In Egypt, the poor also had access to fish from the Nile in abundance, particularly certain dried fish that were a major part of the local diet. The diet of a poor Roman Egyptian was shaped by the extraordinary fertility of the Nile Valley in ways that distinguished it from the diet of a poor Roman in, say, the city of London, which the Romans called Londinium. In Roman Britain, grain was still the staple, but the climate was more difficult, and the dietary patterns reflected this. British Romanized populations relied more heavily on cattle and sheep products than their Mediterranean counterparts, because the cool, damp climate of Britain suited cattle raising in ways that Mediterranean environments did not. Evidence from Roman-era archaeological sites in Britain suggests that beef, mutton, and dairy products featured more prominently in the local diet than they did in Italy, even for poorer populations. In North Africa, the grain surplus was legendary, but the local poor also had access to various local foods, dates in the more arid regions, particular varieties of fish along the coast, distinctive local legumes. The olive oil of North Africa was produced in enormous quantities and was considered excellent quality, and the poor of that region may have had somewhat easier access to good olive oil than their counterparts in more northern parts of the empire. The Roman military, the armies that garrisoned the empire's frontiers and formed the backbone of Roman power, had a particularly interesting dietary culture that intersected with the poor civilian diet in interesting ways. Soldiers were given a regular supply of grain, the pasca mixture we discussed, and a basic allocation of other foods. But soldiers also supplemented their rations with whatever they could acquire locally, and the evidence from archaeological sites at Roman frontier forts suggests that soldiers ate a remarkable variety of foods, including many local and regional items that would not have been part of the standard Roman diet back in Italy. All of this, the descriptions of grain and legumes and thermopolia and olive oil and garum, can sometimes feel somewhat abstract. Words on a page, or in our case tonight, words drifting through the quiet air of your resting space. But there is a way to make the food of ancient Rome's poor feel very real indeed, very immediate and human and undeniable. The bones. When archaeologists excavate ancient Roman sites and find the skeletal remains of ordinary Romans, those bones carry within them a record of what those people ate throughout their lives. The science of this is called isotope analysis, and it involves examining the chemical signatures left in bone tissue by the foods consumed during a person's lifetime. Different foods leave different chemical traces in different proportions, and by analyzing these traces, scientists can reconstruct with surprising accuracy the broad outlines of a person's diet. And what do Roman bones tell us? They tell us exactly what the historical sources suggest. The poor Romans ate primarily plant-based diets. Their bones show the chemical signatures of grain, of legumes, of vegetables. They show relatively little meat, less fish than you might expect from a Mediterranean culture, and an overall dietary pattern that was heavily weighted toward the grain and pulse diet we have been describing. The bones also tell us other things. They tell us about health, about the physical consequences of the diet and the living conditions that accompanied it. And what they tell us is sobering. Poor Romans were, on average, shorter than their wealthier contemporaries, a reliable indicator of nutritional stress during childhood. Their teeth showed the effects of a high-grain diet, the abrasion of stone-ground flour working on tooth enamel over decades. Their bones sometimes showed signs of nutritional deficiencies, of the long-term consequences of a diet that, while sufficient in calories, was often deficient in certain vitamins and minerals. Iron deficiency was common, particularly among women of childbearing age. Vitamin D deficiency, caused by spending long hours in the shadowed canyons of Rome's tall, closely packed buildings, with little direct sunlight reaching the lower floors where people lived, was another problem. These were not dramatic, acute forms of suffering. They were the quiet, chronic background conditions of poverty, the things that made life harder in ways that accumulated slowly over years and decades. And yet the Roman poor were also remarkably resilient. They built a city. They maintained a civilization. They raised children and practiced their crafts and worshipped their gods and loved each other and argued with each other and found joy in the simple pleasures available to them. They were not defined by what they lacked. They were defined by what they were. Let us not leave the story of the Roman poor's diet in a place of pure austerity and deprivation. Because life, even hard life, even simple life, contains sweetness. And the poor Romans knew this as well as anyone. Honey was the primary sweetener of the ancient Roman world, as it was for most ancient cultures before the widespread availability of cane sugar. Honey was not cheap. It was produced in apiaries throughout Italy and the Mediterranean world, and while it was not as wildly expensive as, say, imported spices from the Far East, it was still something that the very poorest Romans could only access in small quantities and on special occasions. But dried fruits were more accessible. Figs, which dried naturally in the Mediterranean sun and could be stored for months, were a common sweetness in the poor Romans' diet. Dried figs were sold cheaply and were eaten as snacks, as a quick energy source, as a little moment of natural sweetness in an otherwise fairly austere daily diet. The Romans had a particularly fond relationship with figs, which appear constantly in Roman literature and poetry. They also had dates, dried and imported from North Africa and Egypt, though these were somewhat more expensive than local figs. Raisins were another common sweetness. Grapes, transformed by drying into concentrated sweetness, were widely available and affordable. They could be eaten on their own, added to bread dough for a slightly sweet variation on the standard loaf, cooked into simple desserts, or mixed with other ingredients in various preparations. There was also something called defrutum or carinum, a thick grape syrup made by reducing grape juice or grape must, the unfermented juice from winemaking, down to a concentrated sweet liquid. This was used as a sweetener, a flavor enhancer, and a preservative. It was added to wine to improve its flavor, stirred into sauces and stews to add complexity, and used in various food preparations where sweetness was desired. It was more affordable than honey and widely used even in poor households. For children in poor Roman families, and for adults too, these small sweetnesses represented some of the most clearly remembered pleasures of daily life. A handful of dried figs on a warm afternoon, a piece of bread with a scrape of honey on feast days, a cluster of fresh grapes pulled from a vine on an autumn walk. These were the pleasures that, for the Roman poor, stood out against the general plainness of daily eating. Small, affordable, genuinely joyful in the way that simple pleasures always are. Not every poor Roman lived in a cramped urban apartment with no access to soil. The empire contained enormous numbers of people who lived not in Rome itself, but in smaller towns, in the countryside, on farms, and in villages throughout Italy and the broader Roman world. And even in the cities, those who lived on or near the ground floor of their insulae sometimes had access to a small courtyard or patch of earth where they could grow a few things. The Roman kitchen garden, even in its most modest form, could significantly improve the quality of the daily diet. Herbs were perhaps the most valuable crop a small space could produce. Mint, thyme, oregano, rue, bay, coriander, cumin, and various other herbs were used constantly in Roman cooking, adding flavor and variety to otherwise plain food. Growing your own herbs cost almost nothing beyond the initial seed and the labor of tending them, and they repaid that small investment in flavor many times over. Onions and garlic were also easily grown in small spaces and were enormously useful in the kitchen. The Romans loved alliums, the onion family, with something approaching passion. Onions, leeks, garlic, and chives appeared in virtually every Roman recipe and every Roman meal. They provided flavor. They also provided some nutritional benefit. And they were rugged, easy to grow, and would produce from a very modest patch of ground. In the countryside, a poor Roman farming family had access to a garden that could provide a significant portion of their vegetable needs through the growing season. Turnips, cabbages, kale, beets, various gourds and cucumbers, beans and peas grown on poles and trellises. A few fruit trees, a fig or a pear or an apple, if the plot was large enough. Perhaps chickens, which required minimal care and provided both eggs and occasional meat. Perhaps a single pig, fed on kitchen scraps and slaughtered in the autumn when the weather cooled and the meat could be preserved through the winter months. The rural poor of the Roman world were poor in money, poor in material goods, poor in the luxuries and amenities of urban life. But they had something the urban poor largely lacked. They had direct connection to the land and what the land produced. They had the satisfaction of growing their own food, of watching the seasonal cycle of planting and growing and harvesting play out in their own small patch of earth. They had a self-sufficiency, however modest, that the urban poor could not access. The Roman writers on agriculture, men like Columella and Varro and Pliny, who wrote extensive treatises on farming and natural history, all spoke with genuine respect and sometimes nostalgia for the simple self-sufficiency of the Roman smallholder. There was an ideological dimension to this, of course. The Romans had a powerful cultural myth of the virtuous farmer citizen, the man who worked his own land, owed nothing to anyone, and sustained his family through honest labor. This myth was associated with the earliest days of the Republic, before urbanization and empire had made such simple self-sufficiency increasingly rare. We have traveled a long way tonight, down the streets of ancient Rome, past the thermopolia with their steaming clay jars, through the bakeries where the millstones turned ceaselessly. We have sat beside the poor Roman at their evening meal, their bowl of thick lentil soup flavored with a splash of garum, their piece of coarse bread, their cup of watered wine. We have felt the weight of a life lived on the margins, sustained by simple food and the small pleasures that even the simplest life contains. And I want to share with you something that I find deeply moving about all of this. Something that seems especially clear in the quiet, restful space of the listening we have been doing together tonight. The people we have been talking about are gone. They died 2,000 years ago. Their names, for the most part, are lost to history. The historians and the poets and the senators, their names we know. The emperors, their names are carved in stone and bronze across the ruins of the ancient world. But the poor Roman who ate their bowl of pulse every morning before heading to the building site. The woman who stopped at the thermopolium on her way home from the market to buy a portion of chickpeas for dinner. The children who ran through the narrow streets and grabbed handfuls of roasted chickpeas from a street vendor. Their names are gone, but their food remains. Or rather, the evidence of their food remains in the archaeological record, in the carbonized loaves of Pompeii, in the bone chemistry of skeletons, in the analysis of the contents of ancient dolia, in the carefully preserved texts of Roman agricultural writers who thought it worth their time to describe how a kitchen garden should be planted and what a poor family could grow to sustain themselves. And in that evidence, those bones and those loaves and those ceramic vessels, we can still find the human being, still find the hunger and the satisfaction of hunger, still find the small daily pleasures, the sweetness of a dried fig on an ordinary afternoon, the warmth of a bowl of soup at the end of a long day, the sociability of sharing cheap wine with a neighbor at the tavern on the corner. These are human things, timeless human things. The need to eat, the pleasure of something warm and filling when you are cold and tired, the social comfort of sharing food with others, the seasonal joy of a particular food that marks a particular time of year, the small luxury that costs almost nothing but means something, the extra drizzle of olive oil, the pinch of cumin in the lentils, the handful of raisins in the bread. We share these things with the poor Romans of 2,000 years ago. Across every gulf of time and language and culture and technology, we share this fundamental human experience, the daily need for food, the daily search for something that satisfies not just the body but the spirit as well. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, as the story of ancient Rome grows soft and distant and dreamlike around you, perhaps you will carry with you some small piece of that long-ago life. Some faint imagining of narrow cobblestone streets in morning light, of the smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door, of a bowl of warm soup at the end of the day. Simple things, ancient things, human things. Good night. Rome fell, eventually, as all great things do. The Western Empire crumbled through the 5th century, under pressure from migrations and internal instability and economic troubles and the slow erosion of the institutions that had held everything together. By 476 AD, the Western Empire was gone. The aqueducts fell silent one by one. The great grain ships stopped sailing. The thermopolia closed their counters. The millstones stopped turning. But the foods remained. The wheat, transformed into pasta in medieval Italy, into the bread that is still baked in wood-fired ovens in Italian villages today. The legumes, the lentils and the chickpeas and the fava beans, still cooked in much the same way across the Mediterranean 2,000 years later. The olive oil, still flowing from the same ancient trees, some of which, in Tuscany and Puglia and Crete and southern Spain, are genuinely thousands of years old, trees that were saplings when Rome was in her glory. The garum, transformed into the fermented fish sauces of Southeast Asia, into the Worcestershire sauce in your refrigerator door, into the anchovy paste on the shelf, different forms of the same ancient human discovery that fermented fish makes everything taste deeper and richer and more alive. The food of the Roman poor did not disappear when Rome fell. It scattered. It transformed. It evolved. It became the food of medieval Europe, of Renaissance Italy, of the modern Mediterranean diet that nutritionists around the world today praise as one of the healthiest ways to eat. The humble pottage of the Roman poor became the minestrone. The coarse bread became the rustic sourdough loaf. The garum became the anchovy. The olive oil remained the olive oil. In eating the simplest, most ancient foods of the Mediterranean tradition, we are, in a very real sense, still eating as Rome's poor ate, still finding the same sustenance, still finding the same comfort, still finding the same small pleasures in simple ingredients treated with care. And now, as the story fades and the ancient city grows quiet in your imagination, let yourself rest. Let the streets of Rome fall silent. Let the fires of the thermopolia cool. Let the voices of the vendors and the rumble of the night carts and the distant sound of a fountain running in a public square all soften and slow and merge into the gentle silence of sleep. You have walked with the poor of ancient Rome tonight. You have shared their table, however simply set, and now it is time to rest. As they rested, tired from the day's long work, fed enough to carry on tomorrow, warm in whatever warmth was available. Sleep well.